Welcome to Your Two Cents, the podcast. I'm Alicia Mccarvell.
And I'm Sylvia Beirnes. Your Two Cents, the podcast is proudly made in partnership with credit unions who are just as obsessed with talking about money as we are.
I cannot talk enough about this topic, which is hilarious because I used to dread the D word, which is debt. And it is a topic that a lot of people are afraid to talk about, especially when you're in over your head.
Absolutely. And Danny from credit unions actually makes this the most digestible conversation, which I could never have dreamed of in a million years. It is such an amazing conversation. Our brains exploded so many times. He talks about the good, the bad, and the ugly sides of debt.
I cannot wait for you to listen to this. You're going to learn so much about debt, how to alleviate it, how to move through it, and that a lot of us have it. This is Your Two Cents, the podcast, made by Bicoastal in partnership with credit unions. So we're talking about obviously credit cards and debt, etc. You need a credit score to essentially have those things. So this might seem like a silly question, and it feels silly asking it only because I know how silly I felt asking it, but what is a credit score? Like, for people who don't understand this.
Honestly, so it's a bit of a misconception because it doesn't mean you're better with money because you have a high credit score. There's 5 metrics that they look at, and only 2 make up, like the top 2 make up like 70% of the weighting of your score, 65%, something like that. A credit score is basically just they're made by for-profit companies, so you got to realize as well, they're not necessarily creating that score for your benefit, it's for the benefit of the people who are lending you money. So it's a thing you kind of need to work with, but you shouldn't obsess about.
Okay.
Once you have a good credit score and you're making all your payments, that's all you need to do. But the things they actually track are what percentage of the debt you do you currently owe, that's your utilization score.
Okay.
Then you have your history score, or your payment history score, which is how many times in a row have you successfully made all of your payments, and that makes up most of your credit score. The other 3 things that people often over-obsess about, is variety of credit. So the more experience you have with different kinds of credit, tells creditors, okay, they know how to pay back a mortgage, but are they good with a credit card?
Okay.
So having a bit of a variety helps your score. But I wouldn't obsess about that one because it's a very small component and you can get a very good score without ever focusing too much on that. Like a mortgage, credit card, car loan will keep your score great.
Okay.
You don't need to worry. The second one is the full length of the tenure of your history.
Okay.
So that's another small component, but the longer you go without making mistakes, the more trustworthy you become, which makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And then the last one is it's a strange one, as people saying don't get too many credit checks, but it's called the new credit score. And it's the more credit seeking you seem, like if you're constantly adding new pieces of credit or constantly getting credit checks, your score initially goes down right afterward. But then once you start making payments on time, it goes back up. So basically it's kind of like, okay, you were great with all this credit, but I give you a new credit card, and now we're a little bit apprehensive. Can you handle it? So your score goes down. And then once you've shown you can start making those payments, it goes back up above where it started.
Okay. I ran into this recently because I own my own business and I needed to get a business credit card, and I actually have 2 different incorporated companies and I needed 2 different credit cards. And the first thing they said was, well, you're gonna have to get a credit check. And the way they positioned it, I was like, bleh, like, no.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, no, I need this, so please give me the credit check. So I agreed to it, but I know that I'm doing it because I can pay those things off. It's just a natural part of functioning a business. And so, but they don't say that to you. And so that's actually so helpful to go like that dip. And I'm hyper protective of my credit score because it was terrible when I was younger and I felt like I worked hard to build it back up. And then once it's great, like I remember one time, I think it was maybe we were applying for our first house or something, we got instantly approved and I was told I had gold star credit and I was like, thank you very much, because it didn't seem like that long ago that there was no way I even thought I would ever be able to own a house because my credit was so terrible. I just never thought that would be something in the cards for me. So I think even the positioning of that language is like, you need a credit check, you're like, I'm in trouble. Like, no, actually you're not. Like, calm down, everyone. This is like a natural part of this process, but that's a really interesting thing. It's like, it's just a temporary, we're just like dipping our toe in the water to make sure that you can handle that.
Exactly, and I think that's, again, it's people get that ratcheted up fear of like a credit check's gonna hurt me. It's like, but you want credit. That's what it's for.
Yeah.
So what I would say is if you're getting a credit check because there's something you've made a decision and you now need this, don't worry about the credit check in terms of the credit check hurting your score.
Right.
Getting that piece of credit and making a couple of payments will drive you back up above where you started.
Awesome.
But secondly, it's just don't get credit checks if it's not necessary. Don't get credit checks because you're curious.
Right.
Don't, if you want to know what your credit score is, don't do it by going and getting a credit check.
So how would people do it? Like what services are there for people to check their credit without checking it?
Well, it depends on what you want. If you
Okay.
want to just check your credit, you're entitled to pull your full report and they will mail it to you. They make it hard because you're absolutely entitled to it because your information, and they send it to you on paper usually. I don't know if now some of them might send it to you by email, but I felt like they kept sending it on paper for so long to deter people because they want you to buy the other service where they tell you actually what your score is.
Okay.
What I would say is people need to stop obsessing about their score. Once you have good credit, your score does nothing for you. This idea that your score continuously gets you better rates is a bit of a myth. Once you hit the good mark, around 700, so it's about 100 over the score that they consider like you need to buy a home. It's around 600, 580, I think, to buy a home as a minimum. Once you hit the 700, people stop caring if you hit 800, 850 or anything like that. Nobody's going to give you a better rate really because of those things.
Okay.
So once you know you have decent credit, all you need to do is make your payments. And then you don't need to know your score. But what I would say it's worth doing is getting the actual report, because that'll tell you if there's things that are inaccurate on your report, like pieces of credit that you've actually thought you had closed but it's showing is open, or can be dangerous. Like a credit card you cut up and thought you canceled but is now saying there's a $10,000 limit available. That's what you want your report really for, is what do I actually have? And what are people saying about me? Because they all have these little columns called, there's a letter and a number, and it's I for installment loan, R for revolving credit, M for a mortgage, and then it's 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 9, with a 1 being you've always paid on time.
Then
So
9.
once you see all the 1s
Yeah.
on that column, you know your score is good.
9 being my telephone bill,
Yeah.
which put me into a lot of
That was Columbia
which
House.
was
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Columbia House strikes
Yeah.
again.
Yeah.
So where do you get a report like that from?
So you can go to Equifax on
Okay.
the website, and I think they still make you print it out and send it in by mail instead of being able to like fill it out, but you're entitled to it. So I would go with the free report if all
Okay.
you need to know is like, what does my report look like? If you have a really low credit score and you were actively working on trying to increase it, that's where one of those programs where you can see your score monthly might be of some value. But I would say once you know your score is good, I wouldn't pay the $15 a month for a membership to see if it moves, because your credit, all those things go into it in these weird ways, and even in ways that you can't predict, like I said before about utilization. Unfortunately with that, they only check once a month to see what your balance on your credit card is, and if it's right after a big purchase, your score might go down a point. And people obsess over it, but if your score goes, it never goes from good to bad over that. It
Yes.
just goes from somewhere else in the range. And that range is arbitrary. Like if someone with a 705 credit score isn't necessarily less creditworthy than someone with a 715. Like
Okay.
those small differences really don't matter.
I have worked very hard to increase my credit and get it to a good point. I know what I did, but I probably did it. It probably took me too long, and there were probably better things that I could have done to increase my credit score. What would you say is like the top 3 things that people can do to increase that credit score?
I would say the absolute first thing is pulling the report, getting that report and learning how to read it. Because the first thing that can improve someone's score drastically, and this is the first thing I did that I realized made a big difference in my score, is there was an inaccurate report actually dragging my score further. Like I thought I had horrendous credit. I just had like typical student bad credit, like something that was easier to fix. But I couldn't get a credit card, I couldn't get anything. And it's because National Student Loans was reporting that I was behind on payments. But I wasn't in repayment, I was in school, and they just hadn't updated it. So they weren't collecting the payments, which was correct, but they weren't telling that they were the reason they weren't collecting them. They had the reason wrong. I called them, they fixed it overnight, and my score shot up like 60 points.
Okay.
So the first thing is just see if there's anything inaccurate, because you have a right to accurate reporting. If there's inaccuracies in your report, there's a dispute form you can fill out, and it puts the onus back on the creditor. So they have to prove that what they have is accurate, otherwise they may have to take the whole entry off. So they either have to correct it if there's an inaccuracy, or it could actually, some, especially small ones, so Columbia House, they didn't want to fight that. So once I disputed something, I found an actual error, but the error wasn't that I owed them money or that I was late. It was, I think, an address I lived at or something that I never lived at. And once I disputed it, they didn't bother doing anything, so it just fell off my report, and then my score went up again.
What I'm learning here is just to know, there's so many resources.
Yeah.
I just needed to talk to somebody.
Totally. And I think the next question I was going to have was just like, if I printed off my credit score, they send it to me, my report, and I don't even know how to read it, could I walk into a credit union and say, like, can someone help me read this?
Absolutely. A lender would know exactly, because they look at those reports, because they look at the score. The score matters for instant approvals and things.
Yeah.
But they go through the report. They want to see how you've actually performed, so they know those, like, how it looks. Because I think sometimes they make it look more confusing on purpose.
Right.
Like, it doesn't come with a legend, I don't think, that tells you what those codes mean.
Wow.
They're not hard to find online or anything.
But still.
But
that can feel really
someone can usually walk
scary.
you through, because they would look at that all the time. They look all the way through your report if they're doing anything big like a mortgage.
Yeah.
And they actually spend more time. So the weird thing is credit cards, score drives everything, because everything's so instant approval. That's how they want to sell credit cards. But mortgages and things, they care more about the report than the score itself.
Okay.
Once the score is above, like, okay, we can definitely lend to you, now let's look at the report to see if there's anything there
Interesting.
that makes us wary.
Okay. So you said step one was know your stuff, like get that credit. What would be the next step?
So the next step is deciding, like, depending on where your credit is at. So there's another myth about credit, and is that you have to use your credit card to build your score. That's actually not only a myth, it's wrong. The less you use your credit card, the faster your score will rise.
Okay.
And it's because of the other two things I was saying, because if you don't even use your credit card in a month, the way it reports is that you didn't utilize it, meaning good, and you made your $0 payment successfully, meaning good,
Okay.
because you didn't miss it. That's all they care about. How frequently you scan your card does not show up anywhere in your report. So first thing, if your credit's still good enough to get a small credit card, get a small limit credit card, and just don't use it a lot. Use it enough that it doesn't go inactive and you got to pay a fee, but use it for something that's doesn't have any like emotional drivers where you're like filling your car with gas. You don't put more gas in your car because you had a bad day. Or
Yeah.
like you would if
That's
you like,
great advice.
the drive-through where you'd spend more money. It's like, I'll get extra fries, please. That's the kind of stuff you don't want to use a credit card for if you've had bad habits in the past. So I would say get a small credit card, don't use it a lot, or use it just for things that you have really good control with. If you cannot get credit on your own, then the second option would be a secured credit card, which is different than a prepaid card. So secured credit cards, you go in, and if you have the ability to do this, it can, like obviously if everything's really tight, it might be hard, but it's going in, setting up a credit card, giving the bank $500 or giving the credit union $500 to start with that they will hold as collateral, and then they actually lend you $500 on a card. So then it reports as actually borrowing, even though it's fully secured. So they're more likely to give you that when you have a low score without any real issues, because they know if ever you don't make the payment, they have your money and
Right.
they'll claim
Oh,
it to
that's
pay off.
really cool. I did not
wow.
know you could do that.
I did not know that either.
Danny's math is making so much sense to me. This is maybe the most numbers-oriented conversation that's ever clicked so much for me. I love this.
Credit unions are the ultimate choice for your financial needs because they aren't just there to help with your money. They celebrate all the things that make your financial situation unique.
Credit unions know that your financial journey is so deeply personal, and they support it with expertise and genuine care.
No matter what stage of life you're in, credit unions are there to help with custom-tailored banking solutions that are as unique as you are. Credit unions are the proud sponsor of Your 2 Cents to the podcast.
So many people like hang on to debt for a long time, even if it's smaller or whatever. They've never had conversations like this and they just kind of run away from it rather than addressing it and even making like small payments towards it. Will my debt ever get old enough that it just goes away?
No. That's called bankruptcy.
Okay, fair enough.
So, I mean, I guess there's a possibility
Right.
that a creditor goes out of business, Columbia House. That's not how I got rid of mine, but I mean, there was people who owed some businesses money that went defunct.
Right.
But for the most part, debt's going to follow you until you either pay it off or declare bankruptcy.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. Can you be arrested?
Not for typical debts.
Okay.
So you did mention one earlier you could be arrested for, and that is CRA. CRA's rules around what they can do when they need to collect debt are massively different than a credit card.
Right.
Credit card company, they can make you feel like the world is ending, but they really can only go after your assets if you have them. Maybe they'll try to put you in a consumer proposal or collections, but all of it is still just them trying to ask you to pay them back.
Yeah.
Right.
They don't have a lot of recourse out of that because they can't come repossess anything because it wasn't secured. They can't, outside the people that they probably have some extra leverage over is if you have a position, a work position that requires you to have good credit, so you
Okay.
can't be in collections.
Yeah.
Obviously, you need to take care of that. But really, they can't do anything like send you to jail or
Okay.
get you convicted of any charges. But CRA, if you owe them enough money and they consider it evasion, it is a crime.
Yeah.
And it's not that I'm asking because I'm trying to see how much I can get away with, but it's those scam calls that you get that
Yeah.
say, this is so-and-so, and like we've notified whatever bureau, and if you have debt on your mind and you get a phone call like that, you're like, I am going to jail over this thing. And I think it just plays on people's emotions so much because you're of such a heightened, we can kind of joke about it right now, like is someone gonna knock on your door? But if you're in that situation and you don't have the means to pay that bill and you get a call like that and your emotional brain takes over your rational brain, you could then make bad decisions based on thinking that someone is coming after you, when really you just need to have a conversation about paying down that debt.
Yeah, and also knowing too that you have power when it comes to debtors too. Like that was not something I really realized until I was in debt, that like I could call and talk to someone about negotiating how much money I owed. That like when I went into collections, that collections agency was willing to work with me to negotiate the balance of what I had to pay off once I had gotten myself into a good point, and they were really great. But again, all I had been talking to on the way there was people being like, give me your money, give me your money, give me your money. And then when I could finally pay it, it was a little bit of a different, not great with one specific debtor, but with the other ones was like, okay, well, how do we want to work this out? And it was more collaborative than it was. But yeah, that fear really does eat at you,
Big
especially,
time.
and I find for me specifically, and I know that fear eats at me so much that I end up doing worse things for myself, for my debt, for my money, because I'm too fearful of just having the conversation, knowing my numbers, understanding, those codes, and just seeing, because I went in to get my very first own car, and he was like, oh, you have a bankruptcy on here. And I was like, pardon you? And he was like, oh, we pulled your Equifax, and there's two, right? TransUnion, and he was like, we pulled your Equifax and you have a bankruptcy. And I was like, never been bankrupt. Close. Never been bankrupt, never filed for bankruptcy. And it turned out that I had someone else's thing on my Equifax thing, and I just didn't know. I was at this point making money, doing really well. My credit score was increasing, and I just had that was literally holding me down as a boulder on Equifax specifically, and didn't even realize because I hadn't pulled it.
Yeah, and that's why I think the report's more important than the score, because the score doesn't tell you anything other than the score. And if you have a decent score, like knowing that your score is 680 versus 690 doesn't do anything for you, doesn't change how you should behave, but people get obsessed with higher numbers, so that's why and that's why that's the service they sell. Yeah. But yeah, things like inaccuracies in your report, they happen all the time. One of the biggest, when I worked in a bank for years and did more lending, one of the biggest causes of inaccuracies were credit cards that you could sign up for in grocery stores and airports, where you did it on a clipboard, and people had their date, if your date of birth or your month and date of birth were both under 12, and they flipped them. The last piece of credit reported for you is the one they take all the information from. So all of a sudden your date of birth can be wrong, your address can be scribbled wrong. And that stuff can actually cause you to not get loans you actually do need. And you might think then it's because you have bad credit, but sometimes it's just a mismatch. Wow. Especially when, if you're sitting with a human, they'll point out that this is the problem.
Right.
But when you do things online, because we do that so much more now, and it just gets declined.
Yeah.
And then you put your head in the sand, you don't ask why or anything, which is very common because we were so used to not actually talking to a person that it can lead you to believe a whole bunch of things about your credit that aren't necessarily true. Yeah.
I made a joke about bankruptcy, like saying that I was close, but I didn't get there. I know that that's not a reality for a lot of people, and bankruptcy is something that a lot of people face. What is bankruptcy?
So essentially, bankruptcy is when you get to a point where it's just impossible to service your debt. There's just no way in the world you can actually make all the payments. So then you basically go through this legal procedure where they figure out, okay, what assets do you have? What can you afford to pay? And the debtors work with that legal people. So you usually get a representative either through a bankruptcy trustee or collections trustee, something along those lines. And they kind of negotiate with them to see what of your assets can be paid. You go through a process for a couple of years, and at the end it's what's called discharge, which is everything that couldn't be paid just gets gone and you have a clean slate. For about 2 years after that, you'll have absolutely no chance of getting much credit. Even secured credit can be difficult to get for the year or two. It's kind of like you're on a credit blackout period. But surprisingly, because your score goes all the way to zero, when it gets to the point where it's been discharged for a couple of years, you get that first piece, like whether it's a secured card or just a small limit credit card, your score will shoot back up to fair at least really quickly. Okay. So bankruptcy, it's one of those terms that people try to make you feel like there should be some moral obligation or something to not go down that route if that's where you're at. But if you go see a bankruptcy trustee and that is the only option, there's a reason that exists.
Is there an option before bankruptcy?
Yes. So you can go and do either some form of debt consolidation or credit counseling.
Okay.
Which what they'll do is kind of similar, but it's when you still have the ability to pay. And sometimes that is the first step before you can even go to bankruptcy, because they will be the ones to tell you, yeah, these aren't an option because there is no way to pay it. But usually credit counseling is when they would kind of, again, same thing. The trustee would negotiate with all your creditors, try to come up with a single payment. You pay the trustee and they pay each of the creditors every month. They try to make it a little bit simpler. They usually get some of the balances maybe reduced a little bit or the rates reduced a little bit for you. And it is a realistic way, and it does avoid going through that blackout period afterward. Like once you've gone through it, your credit kind of still stays intact. It doesn't just get reset to zero.
Okay.
So you can work out of that a little bit faster, and it does give you that. Some people, as I said before, it's not a moral thing. If you need to do bankruptcy, it's the only option, do it. But some people do feel better knowing that I got myself out of this. I didn't press the reset button.
Yeah. And I think it's important to touch on the fact that it doesn't have a moral value, but stuff genuinely happens and people go through things that make it impossible for them to get themselves out of that space, and living with that can be so unhealthy, that fear, that not being able to support yourself or do those things. So I love that you talked about that not having a moral value, because it genuinely, people just they get sick, they lose their job, they get in, there's so many things that happen. They're not knowledgeable in this, and they didn't have the proper support to fix it before it got there. And I think that that's really important to touch on.
Yeah, and I think it's important too, even if it's not one of the things that, people generally view as more, oh, you lost your job, that's tough times. But even if it's something that where you're like, oh, I wish I'd done that better, usually we know more about people's mental health. All of that contributes to your debt, your spending. Like I said, debt is still one of the biggest stressors that most people list on the top stressors in their life. So the reality is, this is where you're at. Nobody should ever want you to not get out of it.
Yeah.
So if there's mechanisms there that'll help you get out of it, no one should make you feel bad for using them.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think the really cool thing that you just touched on too is that not only are there tools in place to get out, not being afraid of credit after you've gone there, getting your first card or whatever you're doing to help build your credit score back up. Hopefully at that point, you're doing it maybe you're in a different situation where you are able to make a payment, or you just get the card and you never touch it, or you just touch it so it doesn't go inactive, to help build that credit score back up. It's not saying you've filed bankruptcy and if you ever even touch a piece of credit again, it's over for you. Because I think that honestly, when you hear about it, it feels like you are there and you are never coming out of this again. And it's not intended for that. It's intended to get back on your feet and build and maybe do things differently, or your circumstances have changed and you are able to pay again. So I think that's a really interesting perspective, is that you're meant to get out of that hole again.
And it's important to understand that they're there, because it's not like a lot of things. Like if you have trouble with, say you have a shopping addiction, you can stop going into stores. No one's going to say you can't curb that. But we've kind of structured the world in a way, you can't just decide never to have debt.
Right.
You can't get plane tickets very easily without a Visa card. If you want to get a place to live that you actually own, you have to borrow money. And
this
it's not really set up in a way where you can I'll just save up until I buy a home. Yeah. That's not really an option. So again, if you make a world where every single person has to manage debt in some way or shape or form, even people who are probably predisposed to, it'd be kind of the same saying oh, everyone has to drink. If you know you're predisposed to alcoholism in your family, you can choose not to drink, but you can't choose not to have debt. So we need to be a little bit more forgiving for the people who struggle with it. Yeah. Especially considering in Canada, we don't teach finance in schools. We don't have a minimum financial literacy, and our financial literacy is very poor. It's something like 3% of Canadians know the big 5 acronyms of different kinds of accounts when they were surveyed recently, and that was a survey done by the Government of Canada.
Wow.
It's crazy how little they kind of prepare us, and then they say, okay, and your student loan is usually the first thing you get, and you can get that before you're legally allowed to borrow anything else. Yeah. And you sign up for it without an income and without a plan. I thought it was going to be so easy to pay back my student loan, and there's a lot of, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of good things about government student loans, but that fact that you're not even really an adult yet, and they're here, we're going to saddle you with this big obligation. They basically get you used to the idea of debt immediately.
Yeah. I also think that part of your life too, you said, you're predisposed, you're about to head into university with the most freedom you've ever had, able to do, and then someone's handing you that much amount of money, and there's no stipulation on where you spend it. No. Realistically, we were talking about this earlier, the tap and pray, the tap and pray with your student loan, and that it is so familiar for me. I said, I got my credit card. Nobody told me how to use it. No, I signed up online. I didn't have to see a single person, and all of a sudden I had a $1,000 credit card, and no one taught me any of this stuff. And
we honestly could talk to you for 700 years, but I do have we have some more questions, of course, but we're talking about debt and how to kind of pay off consumer debt and what's the most important thing. But a lot of times people are, in a tough financial spot, can't pay their bills, and not all of those debts count towards credit scores. If you're someone who is in a tough financial spot and you maybe found yourself, you've lost your job or whatever, you have rent, you have bills, you have all kinds of things, what is the best way to manage your debt when you're in those situations to try and keep moving forward and move out ultimately?
So the toughest part about debt is it's set up exactly opposite of what should be your priorities. So the things that give you the most score are the things that you're least likely to pay. So credit cards give you more score than paying your mortgage on time. But everyone's going to pay their mortgage because it's your shelter. You need to. Like, that is one that you could end up kicked out of your house and lose equity in your home for nothing. So your motivation to pay that's very high, but unfortunately, you don't get much credit for that because they know your motivation is high.
Right.
What I would say is it's important to negotiate and find a way, even if it's not getting you out of those debts, find a way for it not to hit you too hard on your score. Like, even if you have to take a payment vacation or something, if it's allowable, or negotiate to a lower payment for a while, or even term out, because like I said, if someone realizes you've lost your job, you have this balance on a credit card or a line of credit, they want their money back, so they're usually willing to negotiate something like, okay, we'll cut off the revolving part and turn it into a loan, but stretch it over long enough that it's manageable.
Yeah.
So I would say the first thing is just figuring out what can be negotiated, what can't. Then go through your expenses to see, are there any things that are bills that are not debt that I can reprioritize away from? Things that won't really impact me if I cancel them. Like, nobody wants to cancel things that are for themselves, but sometimes it's, okay, I have to find a cheaper gym, or I have to find cheaper insurance, or get rid of some Netflix subscription or something like that.
Right.
Find those things so you can keep the debts at bay for at least some period of time. And then also face some realities about the situation you're in. If there's a way, like if you own a home and you can reconsolidate your debt, it's not something you want to jump into lightly because there's a significant cost to do it. You shouldn't do it and think to yourself, great, I've made everything easier and then I'll look to do it again. So there was a point in time, especially in Newfoundland, housing prices went up really steeply for a long time and then it plateaued. That people were kind of doing that regularly because they go, I have equity again, I can build onto my house. But they were getting themselves into debts that they couldn't really afford.
Yeah.
Their house actually became something they couldn't afford today.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you do really want to make sure you're taking stock and you're approaching it kind of slowly. And be proactive. Talk to people beforehand. Those are the biggest things, but I would say people, you need to really focus on the things that are important. Like, you need to keep a roof over your head. So your rent is really, really important. As much as it would hurt to miss a credit card payment, I would still choose to pay my rent more, even though it's going to hurt my score. I would choose that if I need a car to get to and from my job, I would make sure that that was a priority. But then it's also maybe doing some of the painful things, like say you have a brand new vehicle and you're like, I can probably get out of this lease or sell it and get something more manageable. You may not want to do it. Some people don't like doing it because of it becomes obvious that you did it to people outside. Like, debt is one of those things you can keep very secret until you have to do that obvious thing, like downsize your home or downsize your car. But be willing to do those things. Do that rather than let it snowball against you, because that compounding interest going against you can be a thing that if you're trying to hide it, and that's probably the one thing is I think people should have more conversations about their finances and debt, but trying to hide it and ignore it leads to some of the biggest problems than just facing it head on and being realistic.
Guilty.
Totally.
Me too.
Exactly what we're doing.
Yes. We have some questions that we've been asking all of our guests, but before we do that, can you give us the 5 acronyms?
I don't know what they all are either. I was wondering, I know
the
it's
5
3.
terms that you were talking about that.
Bank.
Yeah, so it was RSP, RESP, TFSA, RDSP, and
I'm putting you on the spot now too.
RPP.
RPP.
I don't know what the last 2
Okay.
are.
Yeah.
RD.
Tax-free savings account.
Registered Education Savings Program.
Yep.
What was the third one you said?
RSP? Did you say that one?
Registered.
I have them, but I don't know what it stands for. Registered Retirement Savings Plan.
Yes. Okay. RD.
SP.
RSP.
RDSP.
RDSP.
Registered Dog Savings Plan.
Yeah, 3 to 4.
Registered.
Okay.
Okay. And then
RPP. Actually, that might not be it. It might be RRIF. RPP is Registered Pension Plan. So a lot of people have a misconception that a pension plan is always defined benefit, but Usually your group plan at work is technically a registered pension plan.
Gotcha.
Okay.
And then what's the last one?
RRIF.
Registered retirement investment plan?
Income fund.
Income fund.
So an RSP and a RIF, or RSP and a RIF,
Okay.
they're the opposite of each other. Savings plans while you're putting it away, and then when you retire, you convert it into an income fund, so you can take a monthly income.
I love
And
this.
there is one new one that many Canadians are going to have to kind of learn about, and that's the FHSA.
FHSA, Federal Housing Assistance
SA. Savings account.
First home savings.
Oh, okay.
You learn something new every day.
First
First
home
home savings
savings
account.
account.
What
Okay.
is that?
So it's kind of similar to, we used to have this program called the Home Buyers Plan, where
Okay.
you could take money out of your RSP without paying the taxes on
yeah.
it right away. So this is kind of a better version of that, where you can put money in, get a tax refund, and then you can take the money out tax-free later to purchase a home. The benefits over it versus the old home savings or home buyers plan is that you don't need to repay it back into your RSP, which is great. It doesn't use your RSP space. It uses its own separate space, kind of like a tax-free. So in the future, if you never use it, you actually get to add it to your RSP and you don't need to lose that space. It's kind of like
Wow.
a bit of a freebie. And the other side is it does keep your money separate from your retirement money, because sometimes, you want to invest your retirement money for retirement. So it's not always the best thing to go to when you need to take out money really quickly for a home and a big lump sum. Because
Totally.
the way you should put money away for something that you're going to spend really soon versus the way you should treat your money that's for the long term can be very different.
That's really cool because when we bought our first house, we used the home buyers plan.
Yeah.
But then all of a sudden, you've just bought a new house, and we, didn't have a ton of money, and so you're then worrying about repaying it back into your RRSPs because that's exactly what we had to do to be able to get there, and that was an added stress on top of everything else. So if you knew that you were saving for that specifically, and then not having to repay it, like that's really, really cool.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And one kind of misconception, it's primarily for the down payment, but there's no rule saying it has to all go towards your down payment. It's just money for when you buy your first home. So for instance, if you don't need it all for a down payment, you don't need to throw the rest of it at a down payment. Keep some for a slush fund. Keep some for those things that you didn't think about because you've never owned a home before.
Right.
Cool.
First time I owned a home, I was like, oh, what usually goes over these window things? Like,
I know. They
Blinds are so
certainly are.
expensive.
We could do a whole episode.
I
I
know,
just
yeah.
got new ones, and it was not cheap.
Okay, do you want to do our speed?
Yeah, I would
round?
love to.
Okay, so we just have 4 questions we've been asking the majority of our guests. What is the best thing you've ever spent money on?
I'm just going to go for the brownie points and say my wife's engagement ring.
Oh,
I like that.
There's a story, like she kept changing her mind on what she wanted, and then the last time she changed her mind, I said, you have to stop changing your mind. And she said, no, I think I want a black diamond because I don't see them around, and I looked them up and they were a lot cheaper. So I said, yes, you can change them.
Okay,
This is
only
a
just this time.
budget-friendly solution. I love it. What's the worst thing you've ever spent money on?
I've already said Columbia House enough.
We're gonna bring back Columbia House by
I know.
accident.
Yeah.
You're just like on Beetlejuice.
Yeah, exactly.
There was I had a part-time job. I'm sometimes a workaholic, so now it's more volunteer things, but I remember when I was working at a bank, I used to teach math at the university in the evenings, and we'd always shared a car, so I was like, it was a 1-semester job, but it was supposed to go on every semester. So we bought a second car, and then the place closed down 4 months later, so then we had this second car we didn't need, and we paid for it in cash. It was like, it just sat in our garage for 6 months.
No.
Needed repairs more than it needed driving.
Yeah. A lot of people have said cars.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that says something about the car industry, but have you ever lied about how much money you have?
Absolutely. When I was in university and I was kind of that head in the sand, I've kind of gone the opposite way. I'm too much, I won't say too much, but I'm kind of just like, I'm just going to lay it out there.
Yeah.
But at that time, I was constantly pretending I had more money than I did because I was trying to like keep up with friends and say, oh yeah, let's all go out. Everyone wants to go on a trip. Everyone wants to go to Halifax. Like just do whatever and
Deal
just
with it.
throw on
Deal with
credit
it when
card
you're
and see what
30 like
happens.
me.
Yeah.
Totally. I think every single person we've talked to, we haven't talked to a single person actually who has said, no, I've always just been honest about my money.
Yeah.
Such a universal feeling for
Yeah.
sure. What is the best, I think this is now.
This whole thing
This
is
whole
good,
thing is
I
the
know.
best tip about money ever, but is there like one tip about money that's your absolute favorite that you haven't touched on that you would share with people?
I would say the biggest thing is understanding your cash flow. It's boring, but like the one tip that I would say that would make it easier is don't obsess about trying to create a budget. Don't start from zero and start adding in all the money you spend. Look at the money that came in and try to find what you didn't spend. And the difference is what you actually spent. When I do retirement plans for people now, I'll ask them as an exercise what they think they're going to need to spend. What I do is I look at their finances because I can find out what they made. I know what they paid in taxes. I know what they saved and paid on their mortgage. Any other money they didn't save is what they spent. So be realistic with yourself. If you were spending it, you probably still are.
Right.
So when you're building your budget, don't start at zero. Start at what you make and try to find the money you didn't spend and assume you spent everything else, and then work backwards from that. The other tip to go with that when you're trying to find what to cut, don't let anyone else tell you what you should cut. List all the items that you spend money on in a month without the dollars in the order that you find the most value, then add the dollars and then cut them based on where they are on the list.
Wow.
If you spend more on something but it's really low, cut that. Nobody should tell you what something is worth because it could be the best thing for you. It might be your personal care piece that like just really is more important. Someone else may not spend money on it. Don't let someone else put their value on it. But the flip of that also needs to be true. Like if mine used to be golf a little bit. Like I didn't spend a lot on golf, and I've started slightly taking it up again, but I'd go a handful of times a year, and I didn't really care for it back then. And I was spending an amount of money on it, but in my brain I was trying to cut like, one of them was like the hockey channel, so I could watch every hockey game. And I got so much use out of that for $200 a year, but I was thinking about cutting it because it felt like an extravagance. But I was spending $400 or $500 a year going to play golf a few times. That
It didn't really
didn't
matter
care
to you.
about.
I
So
love
try
that.
to order it first in what you care about. That way it'll make it a little bit easier because somebody else telling you that you're spending too much on clothes or you're spending too much on whatever fits your lifestyle. It could even be food. Like me and my wife are very busy, so it's not that we eat a lot of takeout, but we do buy a lot of pre-prepared meals. Someone else might say that's not worth anything, but that's more time we can spend together and we can spend with our dog because we're not cooking as much on
Yeah.
weeknights.
I love that. Value, we've been talking about this
Yeah.
in almost every episode with guests, is like how someone else's value is not another person's value in specific things. And it makes me happy that someone like you is having these conversations with people because I genuinely think that you come from obviously experience, but just the fact that it's so personalized, and I think we forget that sometimes that it is unique. Everybody's experience with money and knowledge around money is super unique, and I'm really grateful that you came to have this conversation because this has been awesome.
I
Thank you
agree.
guys for having me. This was really fun.
Awesome. Thanks for coming.
Okay, we have to give it up for Danny.
100%.
It was such an amazing conversation, and talking about debt is not easy, and he made it look extremely easy. He talked about things like credit cards to credit scores and just how important it is to speak to a credit counselor right away.
Right away, he shared so much information with us. It was blowing our minds, but he was talking to us like we were real people. We don't even know everything he was talking about, and he was not making us feel silly for not knowing the answers to things, which is the best.
Yeah, I cannot thank Danny from Credit Unions enough for that conversation, and I know you all are going to get so much out of it.
We loved it so much. Talking about money in a way that you can actually digest is absolutely the best. This is Your 2 Cents, the podcast, proudly made by Bicoastal in partnership with Credit Unions and iHeart Radio.